I'd really like to welcome you all to this webinar on what does Net Zero 2030 mean. My name is Robert Woodford, and I've recently been appointed as a consultant to work part-time with the Provincial Environment Group of the Scottish Episcopal Church on bringing together a strategy as well as a comprehensive action plan for Net Zero by 2030. And I hope in this webinar, we can get into some of the details of what that really means. But before I begin, I thought it might be useful if I just give you a quick word about who I am, so you have a brief understanding of where I'm coming from. So I've been involved in the Anglican Church since I was a chorister at about the age of 8, and I've basically been singing at different cathedrals ever since. So on the bottom left there, you see the Cathedral of Durham. I've also sung at Christchurch Cathedral in New Zealand. That's obviously after the earthquake, the devastating earthquake there, and most recently as a tenor lay clerk at St Mary's Cathedral here in Edinburgh. And during much of that time, I've kind of weaved in and out of the tech industry. So I've been working at Macromedia and Adobe, as well as Qualcomm, both US technology companies. And about 10 years ago, which is really where I got into more of an ecology and climate change passion, I studied a master's in regenerative economics at Schumacher College. And that was actually the first place in the world that was doing a master's in regenerative economics. And that gave me a grounding in ecology. And I've more recently completed an MSc in Science and Religion at New College at the University of Edinburgh with a focus on ecology and climate change. And I'm also the co-founder of the Deep Time Walk project, which, if I was to summarize it, I'd say it explores the climate emergency via a transformative walking experience that leads participants into a profound connection with the more than human world. So I thought that might be just a bit of background so that you know who I am and who is talking to you today. But to give you another little context on that, it's perhaps helpful to say that I was born when CO2 in the atmosphere was at about 330 parts per million. And you can see from this graph the dramatic increase in the levels of CO2 since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And just a few months ago, that was at 420 parts per million. And many scientists would actually judge the safe operating range for CO2 to be about 350. So we're already well beyond that planetary boundary. And it's worth pointing out that when Jesus was teaching in Judea and in the pre-industrial time period, it was relatively a stable 280 parts per million. That was during the time of the late Holocene. Anyway, that's about as much science as I'm going to bring in to the session today, because this webinar, well, it's not going to be about going into the detail about the unequivocal fact that humans are causing the climate emergency, but really focusing on how the community of the Scottish Episcopal Church can respond to this climate emergency. So let me go on to the agenda for today. What I'm going to try and do is get to grips with how the Scottish Episcopal Church is going to create a net zero definition and how the concept of net zero compares with another concept that gets bandied around called carbon neutral. I'm also going to outline the contested nature of the net zero concept and how the Scottish Episcopal Church can avoid the common pitfalls and not fall foul of greenwashing. Then I'm going to present some of the challenges facing the Scottish Episcopal Church uniquely and provide an overview of the 8 fundamental building blocks that will provide a credible, transparent net zero definition that I hope will guide the Scottish Episcopal Church organization moving forward. Then I'm going to present some of the initial results from the energy footprint analyzer tool that the Provincial Environment Group released earlier this year, and then give you an outline and a timeline of how the Scottish Episcopal Church intends to move from this definition through to an action plan for approval at Synod next year. And then finally, I'm going to basically let you know how you can get involved with a consultation process that's going to start in February next year. Before I get on to what net zero is, I just wanted to first outline some of the things that the Provincial Environment Group has done under the leadership of Bishop Ian Payton since it was formed at this point last year. The first is really building upon the significant and really excellent work that was done by many generations of the Church and Society Committee, but particularly in 2020 and 2021, with the Provincial Environment Group taking that work and releasing the initial version of the Net Zero Toolkit and the checklist. And if you haven't already downloaded this really useful resource, I really would recommend that you do so, as it will really help each one of your churches get going with taking tangible actions to address the climate emergency. The second thing the group has done is release the energy footprint analyzer tool. I'm actually going to talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on, but it's a way in which churches were able to calculate the carbon emissions associated with electricity and heating of their buildings. One of the other things that the PEG did was present and have an exhibition on net zero at Synod, and I think that was generally well received, and the exhibition in particular was really useful for us to gain some initial feedback on that definition and the strategy moving forward. Part of the work that went into that presentation as well as ongoing is the research that's going on a robust and credible definition of net zero. We've had initial discussions with the Church of England on using their energy footprint tool. There's work ongoing with the Scottish Churches Committee Net Zero Subcommittee on impelling the government to take various changes to their policy, as well as continued dialogue with Eco Congregation Scotland on alignment with their plans for net zero. And then finally, this net zero action plan for consultation that you'll be hearing about a little bit more later on in this presentation. And what we have done just recently is actually convene a new cross-diocese net zero environment team. So that's all the various diocesan environment group leads from each area coming together to work out what they need in order to bring an action plan to the local diocese. So with that little preamble, let's now delve into what does net zero 2030 mean. I thought one of the best ways to really try and get to grips with that and understand what it's about, what net zero is about, is to compare and contrast it with another concept that's popular in the media at the moment and that gets bandied around, and that's something called carbon neutral. However, before I go into carbon neutral and net zero, I thought it would be helpful if I explain two fundamental components that both these concepts use, and that's the components of carbon sources and also of carbon sinks. So the easiest way to think of carbon sources in our context is those activities that are emitting large amounts of additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, for example, through the burning of fossil fuels, through use in petrol and diesel vehicles, as well as things like our gas boilers that are currently heating many of our churches and homes. And it is through the dramatic increase in these carbon sources, through the release of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, that has the direct physical impact on the increasing temperature of our Earth. And we should be clear that this is the primary and unequivocal driver of climate change that is causing the climate emergency that we are in today. So that's the carbon sources side of things. And then on the other hand, we have carbon sinks on the right here. And these are the activities that can be thought of as ways in which carbon dioxide is drawn back from the atmosphere by natural processes such as through trees that absorb CO2 via photosynthesis. This, in theory, acts as a balancing method between the carbon sources and the carbon sinks, but humans have since the Industrial Revolution been emitting an ever-increasing amount of CO2 into the atmosphere for the carbon sinks to be able to counter this, and thus the system is increasingly out of balance and heading towards irreversible tipping points. And it should be made clear that just planting trees, so that's the natural way of absorbing things, or relying upon a more techno-optimist solution such as carbon capture storage, fall far short, and only the dramatic reductions in CO2 emissions are going to help us to respond positively to the climate emergency. So with those two concepts in place, so that's carbon sources on the one hand on the emission side and carbon sinks on the drawing down of CO2, let's now compare these two kind of things that get banded around, carbon neutral and net zero. So let's first look at the attributes of carbon neutral and what they are. So let's start with a premise. And the premise would be that, let's say you have 100 tons of carbon emissions. That's represented here by the red box on the left-hand side. And with carbon neutral, the primary attribute of the concept is the balancing of these carbon sources. That is, again, the emissions that are generated by burning fossil fuels with the same amount of carbon offsets, for example, planting trees. And when this balance is done, it is said to be carbon neutral. But what you will notice with carbon neutral is that there has not actually been any reduction in the carbon emissions themselves. They've just been offset with carbon offset programs. So we should note that some of the characteristics of this carbon neutral approach are that there is a reliance on commercial offsetting, much of which is often dubious in its quality and integrity. There is also no specific trajectory in real-term reductions in carbon emissions. Indeed, the amount of carbon emissions may well stay the same, as you can see here, as I was saying before. Further, this concept is normally far less extensive in its scope of activities, and the approach is more often used with things like commercial products that are carbon neutral, as opposed to a broad organizational approach to reducing emissions to address the climate emergency. So that's carbon neutral. And then on the other side, let's look at the attributes of net zero. We can start again from the same premise. Let's say there are, once again, 100 tons of carbon emissions in red on the left-hand side. But the priority attribute of net zero at this point is the cutting of carbon emissions to as close to zero as possible first. That's the first thing that happens with net zero. This is then followed by the balancing process with carbon sinks. But it is only the residual emissions that remain after you've cut all of your emissions that get offset with carbon removals. And you can see by the graphic that when done with integrity, this can actually result in dramatic reduction in real terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that gets released into the atmosphere. And it is also normally far broader in its scope of activities that it includes, and it is most often used to encapsulate a broader organizational approach. And I like to say perhaps that the common way of thinking about this is that climate neutral can be thought of as really business as usual, whereas net zero, when it's done correctly, which we'll come on to, focuses on the hard action of urgent front-loaded emission reductions that are needed to address the climate emergency. But I should say that having said all of this, neither of these terms have any standard agreed definitions, and many net zero pledges do not even follow this basic approach outlined on the right. But none of this has stopped a growing number of companies and organizations making net zero pledges. You read about them every day in the newspapers. And as Zero Waste Scotland states, not all net zero plans are created equal or have equal value for protecting the planet. So in principle, whilst net zero is a useful framework to enable an organization to change its operations to respond to the climate emergency, the way the concept gets interpreted and used varies significantly, and is rather what I would call a nebulous concept, or a concept that I like to say is very much in the eye of the beholder. So the first thing to be clear about with net zero is that there is no one definition of net zero. So when we say, what do we mean by net zero 2030, it could mean many, many different things, depending upon how you interpret it. And all you will ever hear is an interpretation of net zero, which tends to be based on the values, biases, and assumptions that one brings to it, or an organization brings to it. This results in a plethora of different interpretations, which can hide all manner of ills. Indeed, if you read around the subject, you will find it is very much a contested concept. For example, Teresa Anderson from ActionAid states that net zero pledges are creating a false sense of climate progress. Most of them rely heavily on carbon offsetting, unproven technologies, and tree plantations so vast there isn't enough land on Earth to support them. And net zero may prove to be a trap that delays real climate action, driving devastating land grabs and hunger. Or this quote from Adam Matthews, the Chief Investment Officer of the Church of England Pensions Board, who states, quite frankly, I don't know how to differentiate credible commitments from bullshit. And quite honestly, there's a lot of bullshit out there when it comes to net zero pledges. So the challenge that the Scottish Episcopal Church has is to ensure that the Scottish Episcopal Church net zero definition is credible, that it doesn't fall into the trap of delaying climate action, that it doesn't exacerbate global inequalities, that it doesn't lead to land grabs, whether in the form of climate colonization or so-called green lairds, and is robust enough to deflect against any accusations of greenwashing. So, with these factors in mind, the Provincial Environment Group have created 8 fundamental building blocks that can be used in our pathway ahead. And I will discuss these 8 building blocks shortly. Before doing so, however, I think we must acknowledge and be honest about the unique challenges that the Scottish Episcopal Church, as well as many other churches across the UK, face. The first is that of historic aging building stock, many of which are poorly insulated, drafty, have high ceilings, as well as the additional challenges of the planning applications that are needed, or indeed Canon 35 approvals. In many cases, there are declining congregational numbers, that's especially since COVID, although the Scottish Episcopal Church, I think, can use net zero and a regenerative creation approach really is an opportunity for the church to fulfill the 5th mark of mission and to attract new people to the church. The third challenge is really, as you all know, very tight constraint on finances that are available to address this. Although I hope that the standing committee, both at the provincial level and the diocese level, will take the actions appropriate to address the scale of the challenge that is needed. And it's also challenged from the organizational culture, which is very different than from that, say, of the direct lines of operational control that a company like Microsoft has. You know, the culture of the Scottish Episcopal Church, from what I know about it, it has a unique constitution that is based around a more nuanced set of relationships, which often rely heavily on volunteers to carry out key duties. So that's actually quite a big challenge for the church. And as such, even getting data, let alone actions, is sometimes difficult across the church. The fifth part is really that the usage pattern tends to, in many cases, be towards a low usage during the week, meaning significant energy is lost during the heating and cooling process. Obviously, that varies depending upon churches, but it has a different usage pattern than many other buildings. And of course, the Scottish climate is much more varied. And the date itself, it's an ambitious target of 2030, far more ambitious than Scotland as a whole of 2045. Although it does align well with the approach that the Church of England is taking, as well as the Church of Wales and the Edinburgh Council. Although, as you will have seen in the Commission on Climate Change report, if you looked at that yesterday, many of those interim targets are being missed, and fundamental change really needs to happen at a policy level to implement the required changes across the nations. There's limited resources, both financially as well as stretched internal staff and budgets for external expertise. And unlike the Church of England, the Scottish Episcopal Church does not have dedicated paid environmental officers for each of the dioceses. And the reason I've laid that out there is just to be really honest and upfront about some of the significant challenges that we face, and different from many other organizations that don't necessarily have these constraints in place. And I think it's important to realize the extent of the challenge that is required. And I think that challenge really needs to be addressed via a complex balancing act. And it's a balancing act between the prophetic and the practical, ensuring that the prophetic bold motion of the 2020 Synod gets translated into the hard practical actions that are needed to get there by 2030. And it's really a balancing of the urgency of the climate emergency with the legitimacy of any net zero strategy that we set. And we need to do all this whilst ensuring that we constantly look at net zero through the lens of justice in all that we do. We need to fully support a just transition in Scotland at a local level, and also embracing a fundamentally global climate justice approach that ensures that the actions that are taken limit any knock-on impacts and do not contribute to a growing trend of climate colonization and climate extractivism. So, with all these things in mind, the key task at hand is to translate that bold, visionary net zero synod motion in 2020 into a credible strategy that stimulates climate action across the community of the Scottish Episcopal Church in the near term. And to do that, the Provincial Environment Group has come up with 8 building blocks that are envisaged to form the basis of the net zero definition and pathway for the Scottish Episcopal Church. And it is to these 8 elements that will help us build a robust, legitimate, transparent definition and pathway that I'll now go on to. So the first 2 elements of these are relatively easy. The types of emissions that are associated with it for net zero are all greenhouse gases. So that's not just carbon dioxide, but also things like methane and nitrous oxide. And actually follows the 6 gases that are defined by the Kyoto Protocol. And that's a standard way of reporting a net zero definition. The date, well, that's already been set at 2030, but associated by that, we also need to look at what the scope of activities are that are included within that. So we need to understand and be clear about what scope of activities will be included in the net zero target for 2030. Also important is where we place the boundary, or where does the Scottish Episcopal Church place the boundary. You need to be clear about where that particular boundary is. In other words, what entities are included within the Scottish Episcopal Church definition and what are excluded from that particular target, and I'll come on to that. The emissions baseline, so how are we going to judge how we make interim progress between baseline that is set in the past and interim targets that take us towards net zero in 2030. So we need to establish and publish an emissions baseline from which to track progress towards the target date, to see how the actions that are being taken are contributing towards the net zero goal. And the energy footprint analyzer that was released earlier this year, as well as the analysis that was presented at Synod, in June this year is a good step forward in that process, although quite a lot more detail needs to be done in the extrapolation of that data, and we'll only know that with a greater asset understanding of what buildings and technologies are used across the Scottish Episcopal Church in various churches, buildings, rectories, and so on and so forth. Another important part of that is what interim targets are used between now and 2030. It's all very well having a net zero 2030 task, but it's important to be clear on how the Scottish Episcopal Church is going to get to net zero and have these interim targets in order really to be transparent about the difficult journey that lies ahead and to have achievable goals that take us on that pathway. As a recent article in the journal Nature stated, long-term targets should be treated with skepticism if they are not supported by short-term commitments. And I think we also need to have our own set of Scottish Episcopal Church guardrails, and in particular, the use of certified robust offsets, focusing on those that remove carbon from the atmosphere, setting a goal of 90% reductions in carbon emissions in real terms by the target date, and that follows generally the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And then thirdly, a restriction on what 100% renewable electricity tariffs count as zero emissions, because there's a number of tariffs out there that are more on the greenwashed area. And then lastly, having the necessary transparency in place. So that includes a robust monitoring and reporting framework for charges and dioceses to help everyone calculate their carbon emissions. It's important that we have a consistent approach across the Scottish Episcopal Church, which is required by all charges to be completed and published yearly. And that will be not only at Synod, but also at Diocese Synod, as well as I believe in each church should publish that in their church buildings as well. So these are the 8 elements that we propose form the bedrock of a Scottish Episcopal Church net zero definition. And hopefully this is giving you all some insight into what is actually a really complex subject, and hopefully gives you more about what we mean by net zero and why these building blocks are needed really to ensure that action is taken in the near term and to avoid any claims of greenwashing. Hopefully this peels back the kind of curtain is perhaps one way, or peels away the onion. I'm probably not using the right metaphor, but you probably get what I mean. Anyway, with that in mind, let's look more closely at 2 of these elements, because I think that will give you a bit more information, or even more information, and that's really the scope of activities and the organizational boundary, both of which we will start a consultation on with you and the rest of the community in the months ahead. It will actually start in February. So on the scope of activities, the standard way of categorizing activities is by using what's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, developed by the World Resources Institute. And this incorporates 3 well-defined categories, which are referred to as Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So I'm just going to go through those different scopes for you now. So on Scope 1, these are the direct emissions generated as a result of activities within the organization's on-site facilities. In other words, this is the kind of things like burning gas in our boilers on site to produce heat in our buildings. And this is actually likely to be the majority of any organization's carbon emissions, particularly if you've got a fossil fuel used for your heating, either that's oil or gas. Included within Scope 1 also includes all work-related travel in vehicles that are owned or directly controlled by the Scottish Episcopal Church. So that's Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 are indirect emissions, and this is normally from the generation of purchased energy, such as energy from the grid, which is used in all of the halls, churches, and offices. And then Scope 3 are basically all other indirect emissions from across the supply chain. So that's all those types of activities that are upstream. I like to think of that as things like printers or paper supply or computers. That's the things that are coming into any organization or church, and things downstream. In other words, the things that go out or are used as part of the mission, things like service sheets, or as I like to say, wafers and wine. And these are the things that are often very difficult to track. And in reality, it's very challenging to get this data even at organizational level. But over time, the church needs to build competencies in tracking many of these different elements and working out ways, particularly in Scope 3, which is more difficult, to be able to monitor and report that. But at present, the focus is on the biggest scale impact, and that is of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which we can influence and measure more easily. So for the Scottish Episcopal Church, it's thought that the net zero 2030 target will include all scope 1 and scope 2 activities, with a few of the elements from scope 3. And the church will be publishing a proposal on that strategy early next year for your consultation, and I'll speak more about that in a little while. So from these different scopes of activities, I'd now like to turn to how the Provincial Environment Group intend to set the organisational boundary of the Scottish Episcopal Church. And the boundary here is defined as all those entities that are within the sphere of the Scottish Episcopal Church that are under its control or significantly under its influence. So within the boundary, with that definition, would be all cathedrals, all churches, all church halls, and any auxiliary buildings, all the clergy and bishop housing, staff accommodation that is owned by the church, the General Synod office, the diocese offices and the bishop's offices, the Scottish Episcopal Institute buildings, and any work-related travel. Outside of the boundary would be all congregational travel, staff and clergy travel to and from work, any personal greenhouse gas emissions from the congregation itself, any new building work or projects, any off-site email, IT servers, and the Scottish Episcopal Church investments at this stage. I should add that much of this work, both on the scope of included activities, in other words, scope 1 and scope 2, as well as the organisational boundary, follows closely that of the Church of England and the Church of Wales. So with the definitions that I've given you just there, the Scottish Episcopal Church would stand in close alignment with those other entities that have committed to net zero by 2030. And I think there, the important thing is to look at that balance that I was talking about before, about the prophetic of net zero 2030 and the practical of getting there. I should also add that whilst these activities are outside the boundary of 2030, that is the ones on the outside there, we expect more or all of those scope 3 emissions to be integrated into a Scottish Episcopal Church net zero plan as we progress forward. So now I'd like to share some of the data we obtained through the Energy Footprint Analyzer tool that I hope many of you completed earlier this year, which focused on the energy consumption in our cathedrals, churches, and their associated halls. So we wanted to partner with an existing provider. Actually, we wanted to work with the Church of England, but there wasn't enough time to do that. So we built our own short-term solution to help move the net zero motion forward by Synod last year, and to really get things going. And I think there is a recognition that it wasn't perfect and it wasn't the easiest of solutions. And I think the Provincial Environment Group have learned lessons to ensure that a more streamlined version is available in the future. Having said that, I think it was a good start, and it enabled those that wanted to have a really useful way of analysing the consumptions associated with the carbon emissions associated with electricity and heating. So instead of calling it the Energy Footprint tool, we called it the Energy Footprint Analyzer, and it had two key objectives. The first objective of that tool was to empower churches to engage with the process of decarbonisation and help them calculate their own carbon emissions for electricity and heating and understand their baseline from which to judge future emissions reductions. And the second thing was really to enable the broader organisation of the Scottish Episcopal Church to create a baseline estimate of the carbon emissions for all church buildings' energy usage. And this was released in the 15th of March, 2022, and for submission by the 25th of May earlier this year. And it's now closed and no longer available for submission. The completion rate of that was 27%, and you will see a lot of focus from the provincial environment moving forward to try and increase that percentage next time this happens, because it really is, this is one of the most fundamental things that any church or charge can do to understand their footprint and to be able to create a baseline of which to track and compare future emissions. And I'd like to give a shout out, as I did at Synod, to the three dioceses that came top, if you like. One was, the top was Brecon, followed by St Andrews, Dunkeld, Dunblane, and then Edinburgh. And a special thanks really should go to the volunteers, the treasurers, as well as I know a lot of clergy in all of these churches that work really hard on getting this data. And if you were one of those churches that completed the Energy Footprint Analyzer, analyzer, you will have or will shortly receive one of these. And this is a climate emergency bookmark that the Provincial Environment Group has put together, and that will be accompanied by a letter of thanks from Bishop Ian. And the graphic that you see on the left there is based on the popular climate stripes graphic created by Professor Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading, who designed the climate stripes to show clearly and vividly how global average temperatures have risen over nearly 2 centuries. And you can find out more about this graphic at showyourstripes.info. And the front image there on the left shows global temperature increases since the Industrial Revolution. And this is complemented by a broader temporal scale on the reverse, particularly important at Christmas, showing the changes in global average temperatures since the birth of Jesus. So I really think that puts it in perspective from a Christian perspective. Anyway, back to the energy footprint analyzer results that we found out from this tool earlier this year. As far as data about the church itself, there were 42% of churches that formed an eco group, and 41% of those that had returned the form were members of Eco Congregation Scotland. Probably not surprising, really, given the focus of the tool itself. And from a heating and infrastructure perspective, 67% of those churches were using gas, 29% electricity, and 4% oil. 18%, I should say only 18%, which is a surprise to me, are on 100% renewable tariff for electricity. There'll be a lot of focus again on shifting that across to verifiable renewable tariffs in the short term. 1% had solar panels installed, and 8% of churches were actually technically net zero. I should clarify that to say net zero from an energy consumption point of view in relation to electricity and heating. In other words, they were primarily the churches that were on a renewable tariff and also only used electricity for the heating of their buildings. And that was 8%. And of course, it doesn't include all of the scopes of activities, but that from the survey of what we were judging, that was the case. This created basically a baseline of 2018 net carbon emissions of 1,440 tons of carbon dioxide across 115 buildings that were submitted. And again, I just want to point out that this is just the buildings, not all the emissions at this point. So this will obviously have to be adjusted upward as we gain more understanding and a measure of the greater scopes and more data input, as well as more data statistics. We are hoping to undertake a process with the diocese registrars, which enable us to have more insight into what churches and buildings there are in each diocese, so that we can extrapolate some of these figures into a more appropriate and accurate figure as we move forward. But without that data, we're somewhat blind as to, or we're crude in our interpretation methods as to an accurate figure there. So the more data we get from dioceses as far as the type of buildings and the number of buildings, obviously we can adjust that figure correctly. But we didn't just capture the data from 2018 in the energy footprint analyzer, but we also have results submitted for 2019 as well as 2021. Which going forward will help us build a broader picture of carbon emissions over time. So you can see here on the left-hand side, that was the left-hand side there, 2018, and there was a slight decrease in emissions from 2019 to 2018, or from 2018. But the figure for 2021, obviously there was a big drop, but that was COVID, and it hasn't been adjusted in this particular form here for that. If it had, our calculations show that it would probably be about the same as 2019. So that's just to give you the method and the data that we've got as far as that's concerned. And if we extrapolate out those 115 buildings, or 25% of returns that we got, the reported figures, we extrapolated out to the whole of the Scottish Episcopal Church, we get a total estimate of carbon emissions for buildings for 2018 of between 4,300 and 5,750 tons of CO2 emissions. Again, I'd like to stress, there are many assumptions in these figures. That's why it's quite a broad range in that figure, and it will be adjusted as we get more data, but it should be taken as a reference point at this point, and not set in stone. And so if we basically calculate this for each church, we would estimate that each church would have a carbon emission of 13.9 tons. What does that mean? I always think, well, how do we judge what what 13.9 tons is, well, a good way of looking at it is via this graphic, which shows what a ton of CO2 might be if it was a big balloon. And so if you were thinking of each church in the context of a person there and a London double-decker bus, it would be nearly 14 times the volume of what you see there in that bubble. So that's 1 ton. That blue bubble there is 1 ton of CO2. If you take the estimate of each church, it would be 14 times that. So huge amounts of CO2 that each church is emitting. And again, this is just on energy emissions from electricity and heating at this point. So let's take a step back and summarize the question that we came here to delve into today. What does net zero 2030 mean? Well, it means that we include all greenhouse gases. So that's not just carbon dioxide, but it includes methane, nitrous oxide, as well as 3 other greenhouse gases. It means that the target date is 2030. I guess that was on the tin, so you knew what that was. The scope of activities will mainly be on scope 1 and scope 2. In other words, the direct emissions that are generated on site, as well as indirect electricity that's purchased via the grid. As far as the boundary of that, it would be those under the direct control or significant influence of the Scottish Episcopal Church, which would include all cathedrals, churches, clergy housing, offices, Scottish Episcopal Institute. As far as the emissions baseline, well, we will need that in order to judge future interim targets and set our own goals. You can see there, and I've just covered what those things were there, based on the emissions baseline of between 4,300 to 5,750 tons. We will need to incorporate our own guardrails for that, and we intend to align with the Science-Based Target Initiative of requiring a 90% reduction in emissions in real terms by our target date, and only use verifiable carbon offset schemes. And the focus here, as you can see, is on real-term front-loaded emission reductions. And we would only include within that verifiable 100% verified electricity tariffs within it. And then transparency, providing a consistent monitoring and reporting framework across the church that would be published yearly at Synod, as well as at each diocese Synod. So this is basically our proposal for the net zero definition for 2030, and it's based on, at the moment, some internal planning, and we'll be releasing a document in February next year for consultation with the broader community. So let me finish this part of the presentation with a few points on the journey ahead that I also shared during a presentation at Synod earlier this year. The first point is that we need a full-scale transformation of the infrastructure of the Scottish Episcopal Church from one based on fossil fuels to one powered by zero carbon energy within about 7 years. Whilst it may appear that we are locked into an aging infrastructure, the solutions do exist and are coming down in price dramatically. Indeed, and this is becoming more evident day in and day out, by focusing in the immediate term on increasing the energy efficiency of our buildings, which is outlined in the toolkit that was released. Every church, every home actually, will cut rocketing energy bills. It will end reliance on fossil fuels, and it will lower carbon dioxide emissions. And you will see as a result a significant focus on this energy efficiency and energy efficiency excellence as far as we can with our buildings, a focus of that in the Net Zero Action Plan. And we will take a fabric first approach to that. But it is worth reiterating that it is important to also acknowledge that this is not just about raw carbon dioxide emissions alone, but also how we use our buildings. And we want to, as part of the strategy, really encourage the use of these buildings for the wider communities. So increasing building utilization will be paramount in order to enable the net zero strategy to support the broader mission of the church, so that churches become places continue to be places of hospitality in service to the local community. The second point, that net zero, it's often thought as an environmental or a green project. It's not. It's interlinked with climate, social, and economic justice. And it clearly has financial implications and can be part of a prudent approach to finances, particularly at this point in time. And of course, it's also a moral issue. For if the church is calling for system change within the cultural milieu in which we are embedded, to be credible, we must surely get our own houses or spiritual homes in order first. You know, scientists have warned it is now or never for climate action, and only decisive measures taken in the next few years can give the world a chance of avoiding irreversible changes to the Earth's climate. And this will require us to embrace cathedral thinking or intergenerational practice. You know, and I think the work required can be compared or is as great as that of our ancestors who bequeathed the buildings to us in the first place. It is this level of ambition that is required to pass on to the next generation a church that is fit for purpose, one that contributes to the restoring of creation, or what we might term a regenerative creation, not the current course, which is bluntly, from an infrastructure perspective, contributing towards creation's degeneration and its destruction. And whilst the challenge should not be underestimated, it offers a unique opportunity for us all to positively and actively contribute to the climate emergency. Collectively achieving this goal will offer a beacon of hope to our communities. For if we can achieve this with all the unique challenges that were outlined earlier, then it demonstrates hope in practice, not just in words, and it invites others to join on this journey with us. So net zero is an urgent, pragmatic task that befits us all, and we must all come together to do this. How we do this is the task of the Net Zero Action Plan that will be released for consultation early next year. And to give you a little insight into this in advance, you can expect it to have a focus in 10 areas, although I should say at this point, this is draft and subject to change. And those are a focus on energy efficiency and the excellence that's required in that area, the decarbonisation of our heating systems in the building, promoting a regenerative creation, particularly in terms of biodiversity and incorporating planetary boundaries, and most likely actually Kate Raworth's donut economics framework of a social flaw associated with that. Focusing and aligning with the Scottish Government's approach on active transport and the hierarchy of transport usage associated with that, embracing the circular economy. You will find the embracing of the circular economy mainly associated with scope 3 activities and will probably be something for later on in the years ahead, but it will be included within the action plan. And then quite a strict focus on the governance, ensuring that there is governance at every level in churches and at diocese and at provincial level to ensure that this is taken as the most serious issue that the church is facing in its future, and having the necessary audits and transparency and reporting structure that's associated with it. Focusing on a program of climate literacy and a program of really empowering teams at the local and diocese level with empowered processes and tools for those processes that enable the teams to get up with a focus on real-term focus on carbon reduction. Obviously, an inclusion of worship within that, as well as an approach to finances, and really both what I've spoken about at the moment on those other 9 is an inward-looking focus of what the church needs to be doing, but we also need a strong strand of building a movement of advocacy as a focus of system change at a broader national and international level as well. And we won't be doing this on our own. We want to maximize all of the work that we're doing by amplifying the opportunities through an ecosystem of partnerships. And these are some of the organizations that we are growing our partnership base with. And to give you a sense of where things are heading, I'm in the process of bringing together this action plan, but this hopefully gives you a kind of quite high level thing of the different stages of the consultation between where we are at the moment of the definition of the action plan, how we're going to go through the consultation and the changes, as well as the papers that will be ready for review for synod of next year. The way you can get involved is, attend one of the webinars. Thank you all for attending today. We're going to have 3 consultation webinars. They're likely to be on the dates that are there, but they are provisional dates, and we'll publish those fully at the beginning of next year. As part of that, that will be an interactive webinar to give your feedback within the webinars, but also there will be an online survey that will be launched associated with the consultation and the action plan, and it would be really helpful if everyone would complete that and give us your thoughts, and particularly the focus on whether you agree on the boundaries and the scopes of definition, so on and so forth. And I'd really encourage you all to sign up to the Inspires newsletter as part of getting involved if you are not already a member of that.